This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 484 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I reference my model all the time on this show during the offseason, and it probably gets annoying. So every year, to make it less annoying, I do an episode that touches on the running back model, and then I do one that touches on the wide receiver one. I do this for two reasons. One, talking through things is a good way for me to familiarize myself with the current year's draft class. But second, I want to be transparent. I'm not going to send the exact calculations of the models, but I'll explain what goes into them so you guys generally know what I'm working off of. So today, as sort of an introduction to the running back class, I'm going to walk through the things that my model looks at and see which running backs from this year's draft class look like that they're going to be worthwhile. I'll be referencing an article that published on NumberFire on Monday that was called "Which Draft Hopeful Running Backs Produced Like Studs in College?" because I think it's an interesting way to look at the data side of prospecting. It'll all make sense in a minute, I promise. Before digging in, I wanted to let you know about FanDuel's single entry series, which you can compete in for a chance at over $50,000 in total prizes. Each week will feature a different kind of single entry NBA contest. You can enter as many days as you'd like that week, and FanDuel will take your 4 highest point totals for a combined score. Finish the week with the highest combined score to win a spot in the single entry championship on March 17th, and a shot at the $10,000 grand prize. Other top scorers will also be awarded prizes. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Okay, so I think the best way to sort of start this conversation is to look at what my running back model does. To put it simply, the model asks the question, which running backs in this current class should we expect to score the most fantasy points across their first 3 seasons in the NFL? Now, to answer that question, the model has a score for each running back. To make that score consumable, I've just translated it into a percentile score. So for example, in the 2020 class, Clyde Edwards-Helaire had about a 94th percentile score. Jonathan Taylor was 93rd percentile, and DeAndre Swift was 92nd percentile. What I've found is that generally anything over the 80th percentile has a pretty good hit rate. And a lot of running backs, 8 of them to be exact, hit that mark last season. It was a pretty good running back class. Now, what goes into the model are what I'll call environmental factors and then production factors. On the environmental side, you're going to look at things like BMI, which is more important at the running back position, or at least my model seems to think so. But it looks at things like BMI, teammate score, and draft capital. On the production side, I'm making sure athleticism thresholds are hit, and then there are 3 main production metrics that the model focuses on. Those 3 metrics are best season total touchdown share, which measures the percentage of touchdowns seen by a player during his best season in that category. The second is best season reception share, or the percentage of team completions made by a running back. And then the third is best season total yards per team play, which is pretty self-explanatory. All of those things are weighted appropriately to then help predict how a player is going to perform across the first 3 seasons of his career from a fantasy perspective. And for the record, specific landing spot is not factored into this. That's something that I look at more subjectively. Now with running backs, draft capital matters more than it does at wide receiver. So having super strong takes before a draft, it's important, don't get me wrong. I like to know the type of player that I'm analyzing and working with. And sometimes being ahead from that perspective can land you the next James Robinson, who my model liked last year for the record. No big deal. But in the end, draft capital is huge. You may like a running back a lot, but if he goes in round 6, then you have to be objective and realize that his chance of hitting in fantasy football is not great. If he was like your RB4 pre-draft, and then he goes in round 6, you should probably move him down and not have take lock. That draft capital piece is important information. I say that because today's show is not one where I'm necessarily analyzing where these guys are going to get drafted. It's more to get a good look at the running back profiles in this year's class and to call out some players who have red flags and some players who may be flying under the radar. Like I said at the top, I did an article on NumberFire that published on Monday called "Which Draft Hopeful Running Backs Produced Like Studs in College?" I write it every single year. It's a fun exercise where I focus more on the production metrics and look at a sample of successful NFL running backs and compare how this year's class looks against them. Now let me explain. I looked at all running backs since 2011 who had multiple top 20 fantasy seasons. After filtering out the older guys and some players who didn't get invited to the combine, I finished with a sample of 46 running backs. So 46 running backs had multiple top 20 seasons since 2011. We're going to call that our stud sample. We should expect that group of players to have had good college production, because good players in the NFL were also generally good in college. That's one thing that people get wrong a lot when they're trying to critique prospecting through data. It's not that almost all good college players become good NFL players. It's that almost all good NFL players were also good in college, and there's a huge difference there. Within the three main production metrics for running backs, the stud sample averaged a best season touchdown share of about 35%. They had a reception share over 12% and a yards per team play of 1.95. Now, that likely doesn't mean anything to you, so don't worry if you don't understand those numbers right now. What I do for this article is I take that stud sample and I compare it to this year's draft class. Now, usually, I just look at the list of players that were invited to the combine, and that's that. That's our sample for this year's draft class. But the combine's not happening this year. So my sample of players from this year's draft class is the 24 running backs that are ranked over on dynastyleaguefootball.com. Those 24 backs, that's my 2021 sample. So I mentioned those averages within our stud sample, but for context, the 2021 class has an average touchdown share that's 7 percentage points lower, a reception share that's about 2 percentage points lower, and then they had a yards per team play rate that's 1.7 versus 1.95. This is not surprising. This should not be surprising. The stud sample is filled with really good running backs who have dominated in the NFL. The Christian McCaffreys, Melvin Gordons, Ezekiel Elliott's of the world. The 2021 draft class is not filled with really good players from top to bottom. In fact, I'd argue that this class isn't all that great when you're looking at it in total. But we've got time to talk about that. I want to walk through the three main production metrics and call out players who have some concerns within those metrics. So we'll look at the best seasons that the 2021 draft class had in total touchdown share, reception share, and total yards per team play. On the touchdown share side of things, like I said, the average touchdown share among the NFL stud sample was over 35%. That was hit by just 5 of the 24 running backs in this year's class. Javonte Williams and Travis Etienne, those are 2 running backs who failed to hit that mark. And they're 2 running backs who are being highly touted. They're usually top 3 running backs in rankings. But both players were over 30% within that touchdown share metric. So it's not that concerning. And for the record, this metric is also one that's weighed least in my model of the 3. Now on the lower end is Trey Sermon. He's the number 5 running back according to the DLF rankings that I'm working off of. But his production profile kind of sucks because he didn't just own that backfield at Ohio State. And he only really had 3 great games this year, with one of those being incredibly great against Northwestern. But Sermon had a 15.5% total touchdown share in his best season. That was the second worst among the 24 running backs in this year's draft class that I'm analyzing. His reception share and his total yards per team play numbers, those weren't all that great either. I just don't think that I'm going to be as high on him as others are. And it's mostly for sample size purposes. There's also Kenny Gainwell. We've got another Memphis running back in this year's class. And I've become a sucker for Memphis running backs. If you recall, we've seen Tony Pollard, Darrell Henderson, and Antonio Gibson come out of Memphis over the last 2 years. And Gainwell's profile is really, really interesting. I'm calling him out here because his touchdown share was 24.6% during his best collegiate season. But his best and only real collegiate season was a redshirt freshman campaign in 2019. The good part is, among this class, his reception share is second best, and his yards per team play, that's 4th best. I would be absolutely in love with Gainwell if he had a little bit better size. Like I said, BMI goes into my model, and Gainwell's 5'11", 195 pounds. He'll shoot up my board, although I do think he's the RB4 right now, but he'll shoot up my board if he can gain well. Get over it, guys. I'm a dad. Let's move on to reception share. One of the things I always talk about on the Late Round podcast is that a high reception share doesn't necessarily tell us a player is going to be a good pass catcher at the NFL level. It certainly helps and tells us that a guy can catch a lot of balls. But it's also a metric that shows intent. When a player's good, his team will find ways to get him the ball. This is an avenue for teams to do that for running backs. If a running back is catching the ball out of the backfield, it tells us a little bit about team intent. The average reception share among the stud sample was 12.3%. That drops by about 2 percentage points within this 2021 class. This class actually has some decent pass catchers, though. But there's one player I want to talk about in particular who has a red flag in his profile within reception share, and that's Rhamondre Stevenson. Stevenson actually has the lowest touchdown share of this 2021 class, and his reception share is 5th worst. Now, if you guys haven't checked him out, the man is massive. I've seen him listed at 6 foot, 247 pounds. But even if it's not that high, he's still a very large human being, regardless. I wanted to talk about him on today's show because he's an example of always needing context when prospecting through data. Stevenson played 2 seasons at Oklahoma after transferring from a junior college. And then he got suspended at the end of the 2019 season, and that went into his 2020 season. So he doesn't really have a big sample size. And it's not that he couldn't find the field. It was that he was suspended. Trey Sermon's situation is different because he was active. Stevenson was not active. When you look at games where Stevenson was active, his touchdown share rises to about 22%, and his reception share is almost 15%. That reception share is impressive for a bigger-bodied back. Now, I do think that you run the risk with Stevenson that he ends up being like a Benny Snell type. I want to see how he tests, and more importantly, I want to see what kind of draft capital he gets. I do think that this is just a good example of needing context for this type of exercise. Okay, I'm going to talk about Michael Carter to sort of transition the talk from reception share to total yards per team play. Javonte Williams and Michael Carter shared a backfield in North Carolina, to the point where Williams had 157 attempts this year to Carter's 156, and they both caught 25 passes. Williams is the one getting love in the draft community, and I'll talk about him in a second. But Carter actually had more yards from scrimmage. So he has a better best season total yards per team play rate than Javonte Williams does. A problem for Carter, though, is his size. And that's a big, big plus for Williams in particular. Carter's listed under 200 pounds. Williams is 220 pounds. But I don't mind Carter at all. The thing is, my model actually has Javonte Williams as the number 1 back right now pre-draft. That's almost definitely going to change post-draft. But because of Williams' size, the fact that he played with Carter, and he has pretty strong marks across production metrics, he's the model's pre-draft RB1. I don't necessarily agree with it, but he's most definitely locked into the top 3 at the very least. There really weren't many surprises in the total yards per team play category, at least on the red flag side. Now, if you take the averages from the stud sample and the 3 production metrics, and if you use that to filter for this year's draft class, only one player hit those averages in all 3 metrics. Najee Harris. Najee Harris is a stud. His best season touchdown share was about 38%. He had a 13.3% reception share, and his yards per team play was 2.1. And that was on the best team in the country. To me, he's the RB1. Age isn't that big of a deal for my model at running back, so before you even question, no, I'm not that concerned that he'll be 23 years old in a couple of weeks. Harris is really good. If you were to loosen those filters a little bit, though, Travis Etienne's name pops up. So when looking at things from the lens of stud fantasy running backs in the NFL, the consensus top 2 running backs really probably should be the top 2 running backs. But I want to shout out some players who I see with intriguing profiles too. Guys who may not have high draft capital, but should be on your radar. One is Jermar Jefferson out of Oregon State. Jefferson's numbers in the production categories are that he has a 30% touchdown share, a 9.7% reception share, and a yards per team play of 1.88. Each of those numbers are just a little bit under what we're seeing from our NFL stud sample, maybe with the exception of reception share. But he has the right size, and that yards per team play number, his best season yards per team play, that's coming from his freshman season. He had over 1,500 scrimmage yards as a freshman. I think he's going to be a super solid pick in rookie drafts this year. This won't be maintained, but right now, only Javonte Williams and Najee Harris look better than Jefferson in my prospect model. Travis Etienne is 4th. Again, that's without draft capital, and draft capital matters a ton. But it just goes to show how decent Jefferson looks. I should also probably talk about Chuba Hubbard. We thought he was going to be part of last year's class, but he went back for the 2020 season, and his profile didn't really get any better. I'm only intrigued because of all players, he has the best total yards per team play season in this class. But he doesn't have ideal size, and I'm not sure he's going to be a bell cow back at the next level. I don't know if that's in his range of outcomes, even though he carried a big workload in college. Now, draft capital does determine how I'm going to feel about a lot of these running backs, but that's especially true for Hubbard. And then lastly, Kylan Hill. I think Hill is a really, really solid prospect. I'm mostly in love with his pass catching potential. He made some great plays in the receiving game that I saw when he was at Mississippi State, and his best season reception share was north of 13%. That's a top 5 number in this class. But the difference between him and the 4 guys ahead of him in that metric is size. The players ahead of him are a whole lot smaller, including Travis Etienne. And for the record, he opted out for most of the 2020 season. So those numbers are from his junior season. So Hill is someone to watch. I'm very into him and Jermar Jefferson as more secondary running backs in this class who could end up hitting. Now, obviously, there are a lot of other running backs in this class who I didn't touch on today, but I wanted to use this time as sort of a primer for the position. If any of you have questions about specific players, I can talk about those players on upcoming mailbag shows. And next week, I'll be doing this exact same exercise, but for wide receivers. So I hope that you enjoyed this one, and I hope that you tune in next week. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week with the Mailbag Show.